regularly scheduled Livable Houston Initiative that has been going on in this room since 1999. There's a lot going on right now, as you know, obviously with the mayor and Metro Board and everything. And this is a particular, what we're going to hear today is incredibly appropriate because we're actually talking now, and the mayor is saying, making sounds about general plan. So who knows where we're going. But tomorrow night, we'll have our Distinguished Speaker Series event at 6:30. There's a reception for Emily Talent. And this is free and open to everybody. It's at the United Way. The speech will start at 7. Emily Talent is a professor and of urban planning, and she's got a new book out called Reclaiming Urban Design Reclaimed. That's so interesting. If you're an architect, you're going to have to come here because she's trying to make some cases about recapturing planning from architects. So she's very smart. She's one of the sort of intellectual highlights of the new urbanism movement, and it's a pretty interesting person. So that will be at the United Way, 6:30 reception, 7 o'clock. The speech will start. By the way, if you didn't sign up and you think we don't have your email, please do that, and we'll get you on a newsletter list so that you always get the stuff. We send a newsletter out every Monday night, and we publish 10 or 12 news stories on our website every week, so all those are in the newsletter. So if you want to stay on top of things, then just sign up for it. And then another event that we're co-sponsoring will be on March 31st at 7 p.m. It'll be in the Upper Kirby building at 3015 Richmond. And this will be the Congress for the New Urbanism Houston. We'll have a speaker from A&M, a professor named Eric Dunbar, who's done a lot of work on traffic safety and new urbanism, and his talk will be how the new urbanism advances mobility and safety goals while building better communities at the same time. He's done real interesting work, and a lot of it is very pertinent to some things that are going on in Houston. So that's free too, right? Is it? I think so, yeah. So at the Upper Kirby building at 7 on the 31st, is that Friday? Today, though, we're going to hear from David Rouse, who's the lead planner on the Austin Comprehensive Plan, and also has been writing about 21st century comprehensive planning. I picked up that article with that name some 10 years ago and sent it to everybody and wrote things about it and so on. It's sort of been part of the Lutheran Houston understanding of what general planning, comprehensive planning is about. So this is a real treat, one, to find out what his thinking is now about this really important method of sort of getting to some future that you actually want. And at the same time, he's doing work in Austin, where we know now that Dallas has a new comprehensive plan, Austin's doing it. And so stuff we need to be watching and understand. So David, love your name.
Thank you, David. Well, that's easy. 2 Davids. David's a good name. It's a popular name. Thank you for having me here. It's really exciting. I have to confess, today is the first time I've ever been in Houston other than to go through the airport, which I've done on a number of occasions. So actually, I had a little tour around it. I saw some very impressive things. But don't ask me like really specific things about Houston because I won't be able to answer that. But I'm really excited about learning more about the city. Just in terms of my background, just to fill in, I'm a principal with Wallace Robertson Todd, or WRT. We're a planning and design firm based in Philadelphia, and one of the original founders was actually Ian McHarg. It used to be called WMRT. So there's a long legacy of, before the term sustainability came out, planning for sustainability, ecological planning, we called it back then. Actually, just before my time with the firm. And I know this has been billed as David said, I'm the lead planner for WRT, leading the consultant team that's helping the city develop a new comprehensive plan. And this talk has been billed to talk about that, and I will talk about it, but I want to talk about it in the context of some broader concepts that we've been developing as a practice, particularly focused on, if you want to call it general planning, comprehensive planning, master planning. The term doesn't really matter. There's many terms that are used. I'll get to that in a moment. But basically, how to address and shape this vague term sustainable planning for sustainable communities. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And here's what I'll do. I'm going to just give an introduction sort of to put some of the issues and thoughts on the table. Then I'm going to talk about, in a general planning process or comprehensive planning process, how sustainability concerns can be integrated into that. And then I'm going to talk about 2 case studies, one of which may seem a little strange for Houston. It's a rural county in Pennsylvania, but it's one where we actually have gone furthest in terms of integrating sustainability. And it's just a message that I want to convey here is that every community is unique. Houston is obviously not Austin, and Austin is not Houston. Sometimes I think Austin is on a different planet, actually, sometimes when I go there, but don't tell my friends in Austin I said that. They are a unique community. So the issue becomes, whether you call it sustainability or not, in the comprehensive or general planning process, you need to address and tailor the issues and solutions that make sense for that community. So that's really why putting these 2 case studies on the table, I think, hopefully will be useful for you as you think about doing a general plan. And then finally, hopefully I won't talk too long and we'll have time to answer questions, and maybe it'll, some thoughts and discussion. Well, how does Houston plan for a sustainable future? Okay, so the first thing I'd like to do is just sort of, I was putting this together, and it was actually an opportunity. I had never really tallied up all the comprehensive plans, general plans or master plans I had been involved in, primarily with WRT, where I've been for over 20 years. And let me just talk about that terminology for a minute. What I'm talking about are citywide or countywide plans for an entire jurisdiction that address multiple issues like land use, transportation, et cetera, in a single planning process. That's basically what I'm talking about. And it's called different things in different parts of the country. California is where I've heard the word general plan. Now in Houston, I understand you call it general plan. Most places call it comprehensive plans. And often there are legislative requirements in different states that comprehensive plans or general plans. In California, general plans have to address certain elements. Pennsylvania, comprehensive plans have to address certain elements. New Jersey, they call them master plans, but that's basically what, don't worry about the terminology, that's basically what I'm talking about. So you can see here, I'm just highlighting some of the projects that I've been involved in. And in the 1990s, and then the last one I think is what David was referring to, the 21st Century Comprehensive Plan. We came up with some ideas as we came through this, and we came up with a term that we called values-driven planning. And that was Annapolis, Louisville, Jefferson County, Focus Kansas City, which won an APA National Award back in the late 90s. We were really developing these ideas. It's a pretty simple idea, but it still informs everything we do in comprehensive planning. It's basically just a simple definition of an approach designed to articulate the shared values and aspirations of the community through a structured participation process that basically then provides the basis for the overall vision, plan, concept, and there's a logical link through to implementation and action. And that's actually now become the norm, but we first called it values-driven planning back then. In '98, I was part of a panel that talked about it. And then in '99, I'll talk about this again, with another panel in Seattle that talked about the 21st Century Comprehensive Plan. So going on through the last decade, a number of plans, ending with some current ones. Biloxi, Mississippi, we're just finishing up. Albany, Austin, which I'll talk about, which we're in the middle of, and Chautauqua County, New York, and another one we're in the middle of one. And and most recently, in 2009 in Minneapolis at the APA National Conference, we've been developing ideas of sustainability, so I was part of a panel focusing on the Union County example, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, that focused on, well, how is sustainability addressed in comprehensive plans? So we called that the Sustainable Comprehensive Plan, and that was actually sort of the launching point for this presentation. Now, going back to this idea of the 21st Century Comprehensive Plan, we talked about it being values-driven. That's a values-driven process that I talked about. Collaborative, which is obvious and related to that. Citizen engagement, citizens stakeholders, public-private partners being at the table and involved in the process is now becoming more and more important. These are things we were spotting back then and saying, these are the trends we see moving forward. Thematic-based, and I'll get back to that. That the traditional comprehensive plan or general plan would have discrete elements, land use, transportation, etc. Now, for example, Kansas City had no elements. They had themes that they carried through and were interrelated. So there were different creative ways of developing the plans. Linking process, visioning, you can do lots of visioning and not end up with a final product that really means anything, but linking process to outcome in terms of action. A regional in focus, looking beyond jurisdictional boundaries, and then beyond paper, and we've all seen that, web-based plans, etc. So that was a 21st century comprehensive plan. So moving on, let's talk about sustainability, because you might have mentioned, the sustainability was actually in that list of things that we spotted back then. Just a little bit about sustainability. I mean, we've seen there, by the way, I find it a terrible term. I don't know how you feel, but it's like vague, and what does it mean? And that's part of the problem. But I've never been able to come up with a better term. If anyone does, you could probably make a lot of money marketing it. But basically, the traditional term is the one that came out of the UN, which is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs, so it's resource-based. Another one that we've heard is development that improves the long-term health of human and ecological systems. That's sort of a positive one. That's a pretty good one. And it's often framed in terms of the 3 E's, or the triple bottom line, promoting environmental quality, social equity, and economic prosperity together in an integrated way. In terms of the issues addressed, sustainability issues out there, I'm not going to dwell on this for very long, but Lester Brown and his plan, I think he's up to Plan B 4.0 now, periodically does a report card of where the world is in terms of the sustainability issues. And these are the ones that he talks about as being critical. And this is a global context for this discussion. Deteriorating oil and food security, climate change, rising temperatures, sea levels, emerging water shortages, natural systems under stress, and then the growing divides between the developed and the developing world, even in the developed world between rich and poor. And Rob Hopkins, in a book called The Transition Handbook, and I'm going to talk about the transition movement in a moment, boils it down to 2 key ideas, issues: peak oil, and what he sees and others see as an upcoming era of energy scarcity, and climate change. Now, there's not a lot of consensus on this issue, and this is actually, I was fascinated by this when I ran across it a few months ago. There was a survey that was done by actually Yale University and George Mason University that found across the nation there was no consensus among Americans on the issue of climate change. As a matter of fact, they found 6 groups that were largely equally divided, all the way from the alarm to we gotta do something immediately, to the dismissive who just think it's just a crop and don't accept it at all. So this part of the whole issue is how do you promote sustainability in a public process, and I'll talk about that more, so that it resonates with people. But an interesting thing about this survey is that they found across the entire spectrum, everyone was positive and open to ideas of energy efficiency, renewable energy, etc. So when you got beyond that climate change, people agreed on certain things. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I just want to quickly talk about a few trends. There are things happening at the grassroots level, independent of planners. People heard of the natural step framework? I'm just curious. Yeah, some people have heard of that. Came out of Sweden, actually, eco-municipalities. And I'm not going to get into these at all. Basically, it's they have these systems-based principles. They derive, I think, from the laws of thermodynamics about not conserving energy and reusing waste. But the point is that we see these things happening, springing up at the grassroots level across the country. Santa Monica would be California would be a likely suspect for something like this. But even in Vandergrift Borough, outside of Pittsburgh, they have a natural step framework. Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, which I'll talk about in Union County. So So that's one thing. Another is the transition initiatives. And this is a book I was talking about earlier by Rob Hopkins. Basically, boiled down to a nutshell, the transition movement is a grassroots movement at the community level, bringing citizens together to establish local resilience and equip communities to deal with those challenges that he talks about, climate change and peak oil. So back when this book came out in mid-June of 2008, there were 64 adopted transition initiatives. And I just looked it up this morning, actually. As of January 2010, Wikipedia says there are now 275 adopted transition initiatives, including 61 in this country, and you have that's what I was going to say. I saw you had a Houston transition initiative. There was, I knew there was one in LA. I found that out.
One in Austin.
Yeah, Austin. I know that. So so these are the kind of things that are growing, and I think will be growing virally as at the grassroots level as people probably in that alarm group start thinking about some of these sustainability issues. And of course, there are the legislative trends. I'm not sure the Texas state legislature will be up there. Certainly in California, you probably heard about this, the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act. Florida passed the climate change legislation, and these are actually mandating that jurisdictions address global warming, climate change, energy issues in California in general plans and Florida in comprehensive plans. So there's stuff in other states are doing the same thing. And I'm sure you're all aware of the federal level things that are happening. The Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program has been putting a lot of funds out there for communities to do energy strategies, climate action plans. As consultants, we're seeing RFPs coming through. And the latest and greatest is a Sustainable Communities Partnership. And advance notice was recently issued by HUD promoting a grant program asking for comments on integrated regional plans that address housing, environmental quality, transportation, economic development in an integrated way. Integration is a key moving forward. When before have you seen HUD, DOT, and EPA working together? They're trying to figure it out. So that was an introduction, my introduction. Now let me talk for a few minutes about sustainability in the planning process and how to address this sort of vague idea that's out there, which I've talked about some definitions of. I've never found a better way of talking about just the planning process, forget about sustainability, than asking and answering three questions, basic questions. Where are we now? What conditions and trends are shaping our community today and in the future? What do we want to be? What's the vision of our future community? And through the values-driven process, this is done through citizen engagement. I know there's been something done here in Houston, I guess Blueprint Houston, that's developed a vision which answers this question. And then the key one, or very key one, how do we become what we want to be? In other words, what are the strategies and actions we're going to put in place to achieve the vision? And that's really difficult, and that, I mean, there's tools and things you can do, but you actually can't answer the third until you go through the first and second. So assess where you are, set a milestone or a guidepost for what you want to be, and then align your actions to achieve that. So here I talked about the values-driven planning process. Here's a simple diagram in the context of those three questions. The analysis, synthesis in terms of a vision, developing the plan, and then the implementation or action with citizen outreach, community outreach, and input as being key throughout the process, a structured process to achieve that. Now, if you think about interjecting sustainability in the planning process, how sustainable is your community? An idea of a sustainability scam, thinking about sustainability factors and analysis. Sustainability building blocks, I'll talk about that in a minute. And then indicators and tools measuring sustainability, which is one thing actually EPA is focusing on in the Sustainable Communities program that's out there. And then down at the bottom, I came up with this thing, threw it in there. Values-driven planning meets the environmental imperative. This goes back to the fact that when I laid out that 21st century comprehensive plan we kind of missed sustainability, which is ironic for our firm, right? But it wasn't on people's minds as much back then. If you raised climate change in the meeting, people would like look at you funny, right? And it seemed like in a year or two things changed and that awareness came there. So now it's not just about values-driven planning, the values of the community, but informing and integrating those big issues, those global issues I talked about that are out there. And to help inform that process, these are actually just principles that we internally came up with at WRT. I'm not going to dwell on these in detail, but ways for us to start thinking about sustainability issues and responses in terms of 6 basic principles: energy resiliency, mobility, stewardship, inclusiveness, gets at the equity issue, and placemaking as a starting point for engaging communities in a conversation. We've never had the community end up with those 6, but we like to introduce them as just the starting point for conversation. Which leads to the outreach input component. Again, the visioning process, that's part of why I put that last slide on. Not just in the vacuum, but develop the vision in the vacuum, but think consciously and interject issues of sustainability and the environmental challenges out there. But again, this can be difficult because communities are in different levels of readiness, right? I don't know where Houston is. Austin's probably fairly far along in terms of thinking and being receptive to some ideas. Other places I've dealt with sustainability without ever even using the term. But what helps is to frame the issues in ways that resonate with that community. For example, economic challenges. This was a big one, the impacts of volatile energy costs. All of a sudden, $4 gas, I don't know if it ever got that high here, but it did other places where I was a big one a couple of years ago. And then taxes is a big one. Well, if you grow in a sprawling, inefficient way, you have to extend services out, it's going to raise your taxes. Environmental challenges, maybe not climate change, but oil security. Vulnerability to natural and human disasters, a big one in Biloxi, Mississippi, of course, and nearby here in Galveston. And then social challenges, affordability, community health. So these are kind of issues get beyond sort of that buzzword to zero in on things that people are concerned about. Analysis, I wanted to talk about, there's a couple of ways of doing analysis. And we were actually having a conversation about this before this presentation. But one is a qualitative level in which you have these sustainability principles or framework, whatever in mind. You can go through and look at your existing plans, policies, whatever regulations you might have, your land use patterns and your infrastructure systems as to how they support sustainability or not. A level 2 is actually to go to a quantitative analysis, which is what we're doing in Austin. I'll talk about that in a few moments. Index software by Criterion Planners is a decision support tool that has like about 100 indicators that you input data into the model about your land use transportation, and it will output measures of things such as this: carbon footprint, energy consumption, traffic impacts, fiscal impacts may not be directly part of that model, but the idea is to come up with quantitative indicators about how sustainable you are to inform decisions as you move through and strategies as you move through the process. In terms of plan development, there's a couple of approaches to developing a general plan or a comprehensive plan. The first model is conventional plan elements. And here's a list of the usual suspects over here on the right. You used to do these one at a time, and they didn't always relate. But now you still do them this way. Austin, for example, has a requirement for a city charter requirement. They have to do like 10 different elements. So they're going to be elements of that plan. But the idea is like, well, what we're working with them is defining an overarching framework and themes that integrate those elements and are expressed throughout them, throughout the different elements. And you can also, some jurisdictions are developing potential new elements such as energy conservation, community form, hazard mitigation is becoming very important. So that's one direction you can go in. Pennsylvania requires plan elements, so the comp plans that are done there generally come out with them. Another one that we're exploring is what we're calling a systems approach. And this relates back to that thematic idea I was talking about earlier, but thinking about not discrete plan elements, but organizing systems. So if you have, for example, and this is just a diagram with those principles I talked about earlier, how do you express those through different systems such as economic systems, your housing, green infrastructure system, energy system. And we're testing this, and we haven't actually done this anywhere yet, but I think this is a direction that really needs to go. We as a profession need to go in, is sort of integrating these different concerns and addressing them as systems. And that's being reflected again in things such as HUD, EPA, and DOT working together, integration. I'm not going to dwell on the implementation aspect of this, but we all know about action plans and time frames, priorities, etc. Capacity building is a big one that we're running into, and going beyond just the ability of government to do things, so building capacity across sectors. But particularly with relation to plan monitoring, I mentioned this earlier, is indicators of progress. VMT might be one. If one of your goals is to reduce automobile traffic, one of Austin's great Achilles heels. And again, the index software, the model by criterion planners, actually gives you a tool to do that can continue being used after the plan is completed. Take a pause here for a moment. One quick question or comment at this point, before I get into the case study. Or should I just keep going? Keep going. Okay. So you can see they're very different places. That's Union County up at the top, that I'm going to talk about first. Take you out into the country for a few minutes. And then Austin down at the bottom. And by the way, Austin, we're early midway in the process, so it's not complete yet, but I'll talk about that. Union County is complete and finished. Just a little bit of background. This is a rural county in central Pennsylvania. It's small. There were 13 municipalities, and there were 3 multi-municipal plans. And actually, one of the interesting things about Union County is several of those municipalities don't have zoning, just like Houston, but maybe unlike Houston, they want to get zoning as part of this process. But so there's that. I just thought that was kind of interesting. So attractive rural quality, but that's basically, you'll see that value come out. Forest and agriculture, 60 and 30% of the total land use. So the commercial residential development is 10% or less. And they do have Bucknell University, which is a well-known liberal arts school, private school, if you've heard of it, located in the main town of Lewisburg, which might have 7,000 people there. It's a small county. And there's a land use plan. It's basically a valley that's agricultural down the middle. There's a strong plain-set Mennonite community there. There ride bicycles around. And then forested hillsides. A good part of the northern county is a state forest. This is going back 5-6 years or so, the development that was taking place. I don't have a pointer here, but they're little yellow and red dots, some of which are happening around the 2 main towns of Lewisburg and Mifflinburg. A lot of it's scattered around the fringes of the county out, particularly between agricultural and forest lands. So we projected that forward, and think about, there's 3 squares here for 3 different planning areas. If they continued developing at that same rate as they had been, at the same density, which is pretty low, those are the squares of development that would end up in those different areas. And imagine taking one of those squares and throwing it and breaking it, and like pieces breaking across the landscape. It's going to would have a significant impact on the landscape. There's a lot of community outreach in the process. I won't dwell on that, but it was a values-driven process. If you're interested, there's actually a website, www.cultivatingcommunity.net, you can go to. It's still there, I think. And this is really, going back to sustainability, this was interesting. One of the things that we did as part of the process was not just have public meetings, but do a statistically valid random survey across the county. And this was a real surprise, because you see what came up at the top was energy conservation. And this was actually late 2007, I think, before the run-up in gas prices. So it was on people's minds even before the gas prices ran up. And another one there, you can see growth management, transportation is always a big issue. Another one that's always there is maintain low tax rates. So just keep that in mind. So here are went through the whole process. These are the main themes that came out of the process from public input, from the survey, public meetings. Again, energy conservation and sustainability at the top. By the way, the political leaders there, it's a Republican county, but they did have an interest in sustainability, and they pushed us from the beginning and said they wanted to go that way. One of the county commissioners is actually an organic farmer, Republican, but he had a biodiesel truck that he drove around. Very interested in these issues. Preserving agricultural and natural resources, of course, and then down the list of sort of likely things that you would see in a community such as this. So I can just give you a few highlights of the plan, just to give you an idea of how the concept of sustainability played throughout it. Again, this is Pennsylvania, so Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code requires comprehensive plans to have elements. So it has topical elements in it. And you can see these are the elements. But it also has integrating sustainability concepts in it, principles, keys, and indicators. This is a simple vision statement. Basically, the town and country lifestyle is key. There are three and that image of a beautiful valley, it is a beautiful valley if you ever get a chance to be there. That came through strongly, and then three concurrent regional visions for the three regions that were addressed. And the sustainability goals, these are the goals that came out that made sense for the community. Focusing, and they're very much growth management oriented, but focusing new development in and around established communities, preserving rural resources, but the last two, conserving, and these are in no particular order, conserving energy and conserving fiscal resources, tied directly back to those, the findings of that citizen survey. So there's a very strong connection there. And you need a map for these processes. So this was the what we call the growth management framework map. So you can see, this is, by the way, is Lewisburg, this is Mifflinburg, this is a spectacular agricultural landscape between the two. The danger was that the commercial development would grow out and consume that corridor. But you can see there's designated growth areas and designated rural agricultural and rural resource areas. That's a simple framework. So for each of the elements of the comprehensive plan, we identified sustainability keys, concepts. I'm not going to go through all these. I'm just going to actually use transportation as an example. So the sustainability key for transportation is choices, multimodal choices. Provide convenient choices for people to use different forms of travel to meet their mobility needs, which means something very different in a rural community does in an urban community, because they basically don't have transit service there. But you can start looking at some actions to start achieving that. Access management regulations, for example, along that corridor I talked about. Developing connected street and sidewalk networks, building on the traditional pattern in their towns and villages. And then the countywide bicycle network is very important. I mentioned there are actually a lot of people that bike there because the Mennonite population does. But look at widening rural shoulders. And there's a key abandoned rail corridor between Lewisburg and Mifflinburg, which I think is going to become a tremendous connection. The idea of developing that as a rail trail, as an access between the two, and maybe it could become something more potentially in the future, but that was a key. And then signage and that. So that's just sort of an example of the actions that made sense in that community. And I'm not going to, again, talk too much about this slide. This is the implementation component, but highlighted in blue is a really serious about the idea of sustainability indicators. An example of partnerships. Bucknell University Environmental Center is very excited about working with the county to define those indicators and work on a program to help measure them to see what progress they're making in developing the plan. Okay, so finally, I've got a few minutes left to talk about Austin. What the comprehensive plan is, this is one of the early slides we put out, and I actually looked a lot like what you had in your blue. I saw a blueprint Houston on what is a general plan, I think. Very much the same ideas of shared vision, aspirations for the future, policy foundation for decision making, and to-do list of actions and priorities. people of Austin are at the top, and this is sort of a conceptualized organization. But you can see over on the right, Wallace Robertson Todd, WRT, is a lead consultant for a whole group of consultants working collaboratively with the city, under the city manager and the city council, but they're very determined that the driver in this process is the people and the citizens. The planning process, very simply, phase one was last fall. Phase two is this year. We're kind of in the middle of it. Phase two is a vision and plan framework. So we're right in the midst of working with the community to articulate the vision. We're going to have a draft that we've been getting through public input. We're going to be back in next month later on to have a series of meetings. And this is projected to go on most of the year. And then next year, the plan building blocks I talked about will be devoted to developing the comprehensive plan document. And if we're still standing at the end of the process, the idea is to have it adopted by the end of 2011 or early 2012. And just to give you an idea that there's a lot of iterations and interaction in the planning process. I'm not going to go into this diagram, but there's a key factor in it, is a Citizens Advisory Task Force that we found is critical in any planning process. And provide the continuity and guidance through the process. They were appointed by City Council. And City Council had three overarching goals for this process. First and foremost is community engagement. If they could, they would like 500,000 people involved in this. Obviously, that's unrealistic, but they want broad public engagement. They've insisted, communities insisted on this from the beginning. Sustainability was their second goal, and again, we need to define specifically what sustainability through this process means for Austin in terms of a sustainable future, environment, economy, and community. And finally, they want implementation. And they want a realistic action plan. The last comprehensive plan that was done for Austin, actually, is called Austin Tomorrow. It was done in the 1970s. That is still their adopted plan. I don't know if you know this, but in the 1980s, they went through a several-year process and tried to do a new comprehensive plan, and it fell apart. They couldn't get adopted, so they were stuck. They did some patchwork. They're still operating on their comprehensive plan that's 30 years ago. So the idea is to get beyond that and to get a plan that can be implemented. I'm not going to dwell on this. A lot of community engagement tools are being used through the process. The community forum series are key. Community forum series number 1 we had in November. And frankly, actually, the turnout for that was very disappointing. And we actually heard a lot about that. And it seems that people did not come out to meetings. They're used to coming out to meetings. But what we did with the city did handling a lot of public engagement, is to supplement that through online surveys and meetings in the box, which is something citizens could take out into their community. And there's been a lot of, that's actually been very successful. And they've now got thousands of people giving input into the process. And out of this input, there's a series of themes that are emerging. And there's actually 12 themes that we identified. I'm not going to go through all 4, but the most important, this is in terms of number of hits. This was very systematically done, going through and identifying every bit of input, is this idea, we call it multimodal Austin. Improve public transit, other forms, bikes, pedestrian, rail. And then as more of the general public started kicking in, more of the last one came up, the congestion issue, road and highway improvements. And that came out very strong in the statistically valid survey that we did. Obviously, people are concerned about congestion. Second theme was Green Austin, environmental protection, sustainability issues. They have their climate protection plan, energy efficiency, the energy company. People who are participating in that process believe strongly in that. Growth management, we called it. And this is actually where there's been a significant amount of debate in the community between the growth and the no-growth factions, I would describe them. The no-growth neighborhood folks don't want to see Austin grow. But there are other folks that want to see it grow, but in a dense manner and centers. And that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out through the process, because as I can see, there's no consensus on that at the present time. So that's part of something we're going to need to work through with the city. And the final one is engage Austin, particularly looking at just one issue to highlight here is the issue of equity and past segregation and overcoming a lot of that's coming out through this process from the Hispanic community, African American community. How do you bring all these groups together when there has been a long, deep-seated tradition in the other direction? So that's something that's been coming up recently. Now, I don't have any of the answers yet, but I was going to close with just a few slides that highlight what's actually going on here. Remember, I talked about the 3 questions. The first question is, what are you becoming? What are the trends? And this is actually maybe where you are in the process here in Houston. I'm not sure, but it's like you have a nice grand vision up there, right? But what is the reality? And you start looking at the reality, then you have to start thinking about what are the strategies and actions to change the trend to achieve those vision ideas. So in Austin, for example, people want to control growth. They want to manage it, make it more compact. There's been a strong trend of growth happening over. It's starting to actually level out in the city of Austin. It was actually interesting to see. Here's Houston right at the top of that growth curve. So Austin thinks they're growing fast, but Houston's consistently grown at a stronger rate than Austin. But what's actually happening in Austin is the growth rate is moderating a little bit in the city, but the MSA is like growing more and more and more and taking up more of a share of the population. So the city is really expanding out into Travis County and the surrounding area. So this shows trends of land consumption going over a 20-year period, and you can see that outward expansion taking place. However, and there's a point here that talks about the fact there has been a significant amount of redevelopment in the city, and like Houston, probably Houston even more so, from driving around, there's tremendous potential for more redevelopment moving forward. Housing income affordability is a key issue. Basically, it's becoming more unaffordable city to live in, which is what's helping to drive people out in the surrounding area. So you can see that particularly among Hispanic and African American families are losing ground in incomes versus the price of houses. And generally all across the spectrum that's been happening. Carrying capacity is a big issue. Water, they recently had a big political fight over a new water treatment plant, which passed barely by 1 vote in City Council. But projections show that the contracted amount that they have for water supply with Lower Colorado River Authority is they're going to need more than that given their growth rate. So they're going to have to look at some other measures to address that. Almost up here. And the last one, congestion and roadway capacity. That continues to be a big issue. But you hear people on surveys, they will say, fix the roads, the highways. And we all know how expensive that is, but don't build any toll roads. We don't want tollways. So how do you do it? So that's going to be a key issue. Multimodal is part of that. They're starting to develop a transit system like you have here. People heard what happened in Austin with the Red Line, which is, I heard from the Cap Metro person, 2 months it's going to open up. But it's a big standing joke because I don't know how they weren't able to get it going and running. It's just the lines have been there. We're waiting a year for it to open up. So they are starting to move in it.
It opened Monday.
It did open. He was right. I talked to him about 2 months ago. Okay, thanks. So you gave me some info I wasn't even privy to. I think this is the last slide I have. I've talked quite a while here. This idea of measuring sustainability, I didn't want to put this on the table. This is, I mentioned index indicators by criterion planners, and you can't read this, but
no.
I can't read it either. But the point is, all these things down here are their indicators. So I'm going to take a crack at it. So, for example, intersection density. We were talking about that earlier. That's an important measure of sustainability, one of their measures. And so they can run their model and think about like 100 factors like this: use mix, employment density, commercial, transit adjacent to employment. So they're good and bad scores. And what they're looking at, how do those relate to the themes? These are remember the themes that I had up earlier? So the idea is that the first model that they're going to run is going to be the existing conditions. They're just finishing that up now. you know, what it is now. And then the next step in this process, actually in April, will be to do some chip exercises, some growth scenarios, and then measure the sustainability of, with the citizens of using this tool, measure the sustainability of different alternatives or scenarios for the future growth of the city. Okay, and that sort of concludes my remarks. I guess we have a few minutes to questions, discussions. Yes?
I think in general, people in Texas, this is not my opinion, people in Texas think planning is a very dirty word. Don't tell me what to do with my property, don't tell me how to run my business. Does it take like a critical mass of people that want this to happen before it's going to happen?
Let me just relate my experience in Union County. Because Union County is like, it's like Pennsylvania in microcosm, almost like the USA in microcosm. And there's the eastern part of the county, which is all the university folks and educated and concerned and liberal. But the western part is really rural. We drive around there and there's like, you see Confederate flags. And basically the two sides said everyone said there's no way we're going to come together. We hate each other. We just don't have nothing in common. When we did that survey, we actually did the crosstabs and compared what people were saying across the different groups. Everyone was saying the same thing. It was amazing that this is somewhat, you know, this isn't really answering your question directly, but if you can get the conversation on what the issues are and matter to people and sort of get beyond labels or planning, I mean, it seemed to work there. I know what you're saying in Texas. I actually was interviewing a Republican senator, Senator Wentworth, I think goes up to, and he was a nice guy, but basically it was obvious he didn't think much of this whole exercise. And he said and though he had some good things to say, but he said on the comp plan, but he said, you know, there are two Texas. There's the Texases of the Austins, right, who expect services, and then there's a rural Texas, leave me alone. And, you know, and the danger, what he was saying, came when like newcomers would move in and expect to get services like they got other places, because that's not what that's about. But you know what is able to maintain that lifestyle is you have places like Austin or Houston where that accommodate that growth and that balance that allows that rural Texas to survive or to be maintained. So if somehow you can capture the connections and make people understand the connections. Yes?
It seems it's easy in Austin to say that they don't want sprawl, but the city of Austin is fairly well developed. But when you have ETJ controlled by the LCRA, they can grant water district approval, and you can have whatever developer wants in the ETJ without Austin being able to say much of anything. I mean, it's wonderful to say we don't want sprawl, but you can see by your map that it's
happening.
It's going to continue to happen along not only the LCRA, but go straight to the state and get water district approval. And Austin may pose an objection, but they can accept it or ignore it.
Yeah, that's a good. And then beyond Austin,
yeah,
what's happening where Williamson County is really where that tremendous amount of growth is. Actually, one of the myths in Austin, not a myth, but they have the desired development zone. If you know, in Austin to the east and the west is a water supply area, so they desire development to go in that direction. And then there's actually a paper written that's our path of growth. Well, we did an analysis of susceptibility to change analysis, looked at different factors, and that isn't the path of growth. The path of growth was obviously north, moving up to Williamson County.
Their path is east, right?
What's that?
It's toward Houston. They want us to the flatlands toward the...
Well, it isn't, though. The thing is that in Austin,
that's
the path...
That's what Austin wants.
Yeah, they want it to the east, but really to the north and north, exactly. And that's why I put those last slides on the table. I'm sure you're right. We haven't gotten there in terms of figuring out how to do it. But it's how difficult it is to find solutions that will work for these issues. It's going to be a challenge. Yes?
What do you think is the correlation between a city's receptivity to comprehensive planning as to whether it's a council manager or a strong mayor? Because just my observation, a strong mayor seems to have a lot less motivation to embrace a comprehensive planning process because they've got a plan that they've run on and they've got priorities, and you're kind of surrendering that in a strong mayor form. maybe in a way that you're not in a.
Actually, that's a
council
that's
manager
right. I
form
never
like
grew up
Austin.
in opposition. I actually use my home city as a adopted home city as an example. Philadelphia. You know, Mayor Ed Rendell, great guy. No interest in planning. I tell you, he just wanted to be able to make the deals, you know, the economic deeds. He did not want to have a comprehensive plan. So he stripped the planning department basically of any power. Mayor Street came after him. There's actually a mayor now that believes in planning. They're doing a lot of good stuff now. Mayor Nutter, the most recent mayor. But I think you're right. I think that you can also see that, though, in some city councils that also don't want to have anything that ties their hands to do things. I've had city councils accept but not adopt comprehensive plan. I had one in Annapolis that adopted the comprehensive plan, but their resolution said they didn't necessarily endorse any single recommendation within it. So it's all sort of engagement. That's a true story. Yes?
Would you react to my simplistic comparison of 70s planning to 2000 planning? It started out with development and growth has to contribute to a tax-based economics. 40 years later, growth should be managed, sprawl should be limited, and quality of life supreme. Would you agree that that has been the 40-year trend in planning?
I think that's a way of looking at it. I think that the missing link in the latter is that, you know, quality of life is sort of a vague term that in some places is like NIMBY, right? Like protect my neighborhood. But all those things you talked about in the latter, actually fiscal sense, tax rates, you know, having to provide new schools and add into night and provide services with sprawl. And that's why I said earlier, like, look at the fiscal implications of this. I mean, in Union County, and, you know, another thing is you think about people, and this is something that came up there, is, you know, people like who buy houses out there in the middle of the farmland. It's fine when they have families, but as they age and get elderly, how do you serve them, you know, and where do they live, and what happens to those houses? So there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of reasons other than just quality of life for that last, you know, that paradigm.
Translate that to repressed reality.
What's repressed reality? Quality of life.
In terms of the consequences of growth. I haven't heard a whole lot of movement about no growth, but there's always growth, but that's going to cost.
Yeah,
All kinds of
cost
places.
of growth,
So there
yeah.
doesn't seem to be much realization of accommodating the tax-based management and the growth management.
Well, they have to come together. I think that's the idea of the dense compact.
No sprawl,
yeah.
we want more.
And then when you start doing that, going back to the theme of sustainability, you're able to do things like transit-oriented development. And then those elderly people, maybe after they stop driving, they can live somewhere and have access to
But the
transit.
trade-offs for those adaptations also aren't highly publicized.
No, yeah, there's cost benefits. Not everyone wants to live that way either, particularly in Texas, I'm sure.
What forms of enforcement and implementation do these various entities adopt? And is zoning the only one that has any teeth to it, or are there other ways of doing that?
You know, the zoning one's interesting because places that have zoning, one of the things we hear is you can't count on zoning. Zoning can be changed. So zoning is a worse tool that we have. It's actually worked pretty well in Lancaster County because there's a community consensus for zoning. And, you know, again, I said earlier today, and I'll get back to your question in a minute, but driving around here, it was like, you know, it's no zoning city, it was anything goes. But actually, some of the pattern here was sort of like what you actually aspire to in some places where they have that single-use Euclidean zoning, single-family house after single-family house. I saw, you know, like single-family houses next to maybe, you know, small-scale multifamily, but it all seemed to kind of work, and there was a diverse fabric.
Short-term work.
What's that?
Short-term.
Short-term, but back to your question, there are other tools. There are many other tools to use. You know, capital investment is a big one. In rural places, that's actually very important. And other places where you put your sewer and water to determine the path of growth. There are other regulatory approaches. I know form-based codes have been talked about here. I mean, places that use that. And actually, what that tries to do is just maybe Houston has an opportunity. I'm not endorsing it or not, but that's the whole purpose of form-based codes, is to address the deficiencies of Euclidean zoning. So maybe Houston might have an opportunity to look at leaping beyond existing zoning. That's an example. Incentive-based approaches and different. I'm sure you have regulations and things in place. They're just not zoning. So there's all that regulatory side. But basically, it's the capital investment side, the regulatory, and then looking at different types of partnerships is another one. The public-private partnerships is another one. Yes.
Would you go back to the slide where you listed the issues regarding transportation that the community had listed?
Oh, this one? No, the multi-theme. Yeah. This is more simplistic but boiled down.
Right there. What did we say? Theme 1, the multimodal.
This is number of hits. This is like more people mentioned transportation. This is like thousands of hits. Yeah.
Road and highway improvements.
Uh-huh.
Generic term, I guess. But theme 2, green knowledge and environmental protection. Are those contradictory?
There are some inherent contradictions. Let me tell you about that theme 1. After we got out of the community forum meetings, where there was only like maybe 300 or 400 people participated, that wasn't even on the radar screen. None of them. Those were the people that would make the effort to get to the meetings. They talked about the other stuff. That came out in the community. It came out really strong in the citizen survey, that statistically valid survey, and then all the online surveys seem to be. So you're right. There's a built-in contradiction here. This isn't a perfect process. So the issue becomes, how do you deal with these issues? The person who did the survey said, when he presented the results, said, the other things were listed in the survey, but that was right up at the top. He said, if you address all the other things without addressing that, people are going to be really upset, right? So, but I think actually, I'm talking long, but going back to your original point, I think it's not necessarily contradictory if you think of it in terms of targeted improvements that don't maybe encourage kind of patterns you're talking about, but deal with existing congestion, which congestion obviously degrades air quality and the sustainability issue.
Was there a street choice in that as opposed to road and highway improvements?
Streets?
If you were thinking of streets and you only had that, would you choose that?
I'm trying to remember the way the survey was worded. I think there was that, it was in there, but the streets, it's sort of like Houston, right? And you can drive around the streets here, as far as I can tell, fairly easily. Austin, the streets aren't the issue. It's the height. Yeah. So that's why that one rose on top. I think there was a street, and that also ranked high, but not as high as this one.
It seems to me that Houston is increasingly unhealthy and unsafe. And it seems to me those are some of the things that we would really want to be bringing out in any plan or any concept. Yeah, are those the themes that you want to examine?
What was that, the last one?
What are those the themes that you might want to examine? You didn't mention.
Yeah, well, there were 8 more themes. I meant to read them. You said safety, right?
Safety and health.
Yeah. Safety and
Health.
Yeah. Let me. The 8 other themes that aren't listed here, and I just, I knew this was going to be too long. Recreational Austin, prosperous Austin, healthy Austin, creative Austin, very important there, right? They say keep Austin weird, right? They got the arts and music scene. Educated Austin, which is actually rising up. Affordable Austin, safe Austin, which among certain segments of the community, very important. And last, fiscally responsible Austin. I think there were some Tea Partiers who are starting to mobilize, so that might rise up in the ranks. Yes?
With a lot of these that we do for the cities, these comprehensive plans, are the budgets already there? The city has decided they want this and they put out an RFP or something?
Yeah, that's what they did in Austin, and they said, this is the budget, we know it's not enough. So, but what they've been really good about Austin, I can't believe how big their planning staff is. I've never seen so many planners there. So they have a lot of talented planners, and they're doing a lot of the work. That's the only way that, as a consultant team, that we are able to sustain. But they did allocate, I'll tell you what it was, they allocated $1.3 million. They said if it was the following year, they wouldn't have been able to do it. It was just they got it in because of the fiscal, and they said this is a budget, so we figured out a scope of work and spent a lot of time this is what we can do within that budget. And there's maybe a $40,000 contingency, so there's not much leeway there.
So were all those people, all those companies that you listed, were they subcontractors?
They're subconsultants, and they're all of them are local, except for Criterion Planners. I mentioned that they're actually based in Portland. They do the sustainability model. Yes?
Going back to the earlier question on implementation and zoning, how fine-grained do these efforts typically get to on the implementation and action plan end, and what are people's expectations as this process, as far as how far that's going to go when they participate?
We like to talk about comprehensive plans or general plans as being at the 30,000-foot level. You're not getting down in the weeds of parcel specific or dealing with like fine-grained implementation, which is really important in Austin because they've been developing all these neighborhood plans that they're very protective of, and they're afraid that this is going to like overrule their neighborhood plans. They're saying, no, no, no. This is a framework. So now when you come back and redo your neighborhood plan or develop new ones, less than half the city has neighborhood plans, you have a framework to operate under. And another issue there is, we talked about zoning. We are not doing a future land use map for Austin. They don't want to go there. They don't want to get to that parcel by parcel level. That's actually done in their neighborhood plans, but we will do some kind of growth, some kind of framework map, sort of like what we did in Union County. Union County, on the other hand, we actually went beyond that and did a land use map, a future land use map, and it was small enough we could do that, work with all the municipalities, which will there become the basis for revising their zoning or doing new zoning in some of the municipalities. But there were other things that we're talking about, like access management. There are a lot of other tools, and it wasn't just about zoning and comprehensive plan. Yes?
Kind of going along with what he had said in the back about the health of the community. A community's plan directly impacts the community's health. So the health should really directly impact the community plan. And it seems to me that it shouldn't just be one theme, that health should be infused in all of those themes and the connection to the community's health. And I work with an obesity prevention program, and it's nationally recognized now that obesity isn't an individual weight problem, it's a built environment problem and how a community is set up. So do you have public health partners in your community planning process, or do you see more and more health language being infused in community plans?
Actually, a very good friend of mine is with the Centers of Disease Control in Atlanta. We did a green space, green infrastructure plan there. And she was the project planner there and moved over there. And we've actually given presentations together on this issue. You're absolutely right. I think, it's not just a theme in isolation, and I can't really draw it here, but the way we're imagining it, remember I said they have to have these discrete elements? So land use, transportation. Think of those elements as a matrix, a row across the top. Think about these themes as going down the side. So if healthy community is one theme, every one of those elements needs to address how it develops a healthy community. So that's where I think the integration comes in. And it's a lot has to do about land use and transportation patterns. I actually am able to take the train to Philadelphia each day. I walk at each end. I can't tell you how much it does for my health rather than having to drive there. I love it. So you're absolutely right that it's a key thing. It's a key issue. It's the unspoken part of the healthcare debate, actually. The reason we have such escalating high costs of healthcare, a large part of it is because of the health of our citizens.
Talking about Houston, our situation is in the 90s, City Council instructed the planning department to do a comprehensive plan. They haven't done that. And the last administration, there was a planning subcommittee that examined comprehensive plan and concluded that comprehensive plans are stupid and that the city should instead pursue disconnected individual plans. And they starting with a mobility plan and a drainage and water plan. And so that's currently where Houston is planning department doing separate plans. I wonder if you would be willing to hazard what the implications of sort of not doing a comprehensive.
Well, that is a model that you can use, actually. but it works when you have a overall sort of unifying framework, the vision part of it, that everyone is basically bought into. Can you say, does Houston have a vision that you can say generally the community is bought into?
I mean, some would argue that
Development.
Livable Houston is a fairly rigorous and I think representative vision, but the city of Houston, used to not know about it, now maybe knows there's such a thing.
Because let me tell you, what they do in done a lot of work in Lancaster County. Actually, they won the EPA Smart Growth Overall Excellence Award recently. They had a vision that they adopted in 1998 or 1999. It's very general. It's not much more, basically as general as the one that you have. And they've never bothered to go back and change it. And they keep developing piecemeal plans. But they have that vision, they have real sense of what the values of that community are, which are like Union County, a lot of it's based in agriculture, the rural preservation. Even the home builders, by the way, are very supportive of planning in Lancaster County and agricultural preservation because they've been given density in the growth areas. They say they understand the trade-off, so we can be dense. So they do things like they develop a green infrastructure plan we were involved in a tourism plan. So they do piecemeal plans, but they point back to that vision and say that's the overall framework. So that's a modelable approach that you can take.
Go a little further with that. You've seen that citizens' vision for Houston's future. And let's just say you were called in to do a general plan. Could you start there? Or would you say you need another public round?
Doesn't matter what I say. It matters can the community say we accept this vision, and we think it's a good vision and it's represented. I could start there if the community says that.
How would you ascertain that the community supports that?
Well, that would sort of be up to you to kind of, right?
Okay.
It's up to the community to determine that. I think the political leaders need to be behind it. What you might want to do is like how long ago was that done?
It's evolved, but the biggest event was 2003.
Yeah, so it's a little bit old. You probably want to do like maybe not a complete redo, but a checkup or something to like do some surveys and sort of get the word out and get some people out. I mean, you want to do that to get excitement up about the process anyway.
I'm troubled about following the money. And Houston is fortunate because while we don't like the smog, or we don't like the smell, those plants are a cash cow to the city. And citizens who vote don't like taxes. And so they complain about the cash cow, but they take the money. And you can look at another city nearby, Sugar Land, is having lots of problems. They're trying to attract cash cows into their city because they can't even afford their police department. And that's because the citizens don't want to pay the taxes. They don't want to be burgled, but it's a hard match. And Houston is very fortunate in that it does have a good source to pay most. We're going to be, what, 15 million in the hole or something. That's not a lot.
Yeah, I actually I saw some figures in the paper about how much cities were in the hole, and I came to Houston. I said, "That's all? God, those guys are in great shape compared to like billions." You're right.
And we're very fortunate, and they can squeeze on a few places and get the money if they have to. And in Houston, whereas Bel Air, for example, has probably a bigger time, more difficult time, and we've got some blessings here.
Oh yeah, you have a lot to work with. I mean, compared to some places I've been, it's just like the absolute opposite. Cumberland, Maryland, a little town, manufacturing town, is an example where they lost their manufacturing base and basically are trying to reinvent their economy. But that was the impetus for planning it. They're very strong on planning as a way of doing that.
We're going to lose Clear Lake City probably shortly. Big deal. No one's really going to worry about that.
Yes?
How are primary and secondary education issues integrated into the Austin plan?
It's going to be huge because it's come up as the big issue, and it's a big issue everywhere we're going. And you know, I've been talking to, you know, we're doing lots of stakeholder interviews, and AISD, Austin Independent School District, the biggest school district there. Another one is Round Rock, and we've been talking to folks about that. And they, particularly AISD, has tremendous issues with poverty, in non-English speakers, English is second language that they're trying to deal with. So it's going to be, it's a big issue that we're going to, and how a comprehensive plan or a general plan can affect that kind of change is unclear. But maybe it goes, you look at the elements and things that can be done and identify, it's not going to turn it around by itself, but it's an issue that's going to be addressed. It's also, by the way, addressing higher education. Education is a continuum. And one of the things I've been becoming more and more aware of is like the incredible role of community colleges in terms of like they're a transition for people that maybe, you know, come from not well-off immigrants, other backgrounds into the workforce because of the training that they're doing. And there are jobs out there, I hear all over and over again wherever I go. They can't find trained people to fill them, and that's a role, a gap in the community colleges find. And there's a very strong community college in Austin.
To what degree could you guess the influence of the federal administration's goals? You have stimulus payments, you have education targeted or jobs or whatever. Doesn't that have a rollover effect on the planning at the lower level?
I think it will. It's going to take time. I think the stimulus packages that came out was like throw money at shovel-ready projects. So you didn't see it there, except in like the one I had mentioned earlier, the energy program, which actually started promoting that. But you're going to see more and more of that. I think HUD, the Sustainable Communities Planning Grant Program that's out now, is an indication. It's going to be integration. And I keep talking about the same thing: energy, green jobs, green economy, and doing things in an integrated way. And there's other legislation that's following behind it. I think you'll see it in a big way in the next Transportation Act. What's that?
Multimodal transportation is now emphasized from Washington.
Yeah.
Obviously, if there's money at the end of that, aren't communities going to go for that package, whether or not they would plan for it?
Yeah, I think the ones that have planned for it are going to be in the best position. Philadelphia is an example. They're putting the region, not the city, just the city, is putting together an application under that program, or intend to, where they're going to focus on transit-oriented development. Because Philadelphia has a tremendous transit system.
Would it have happened without that federal assistance, is my question, I guess.
I think what they're looking at is to get funds that they wouldn't have had access to that they need. It's gap funding. Okay?
One more question before we play.
I'm 15 minutes over here.
Just briefly, there was a mention in there of the regional aspect of the plan in Austin. Could you talk about the regional cooperation in the planning process, and then what the ramifications are in
There's
implementation?
not enough. I'm going to say that bluntly, and they recognize they need it. There's some, actually, the most that there is right now is that residents of the ETJ are represented. It's the study area represented on the planning, the steering committee. But the dynamics, Austin is no longer the 100-pound. They're the big player, but they're no longer this dominant player in that region. I mean, Round Rock, Williamson County, Round Rock have their own goals and their own agendas. There's regional transit. They need to come to the table, and I think there's a recognition that hasn't happened yet. There at least needs to be talked to, but I think that's a big issue for this process, and for any process and that's one reason why the HUD, EPA, DOT is talking about doing things regionally, because they recognize it, but it's not the way we're used to operating, right? So it's difficult.
So thank you. Let's thank David for Jonathan Schoolian, who arranged all this, who's also his WRC and who works in this here. I guess that's it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.